percent precipitation. And so an important first step for us is to first edit the hydrography data so that it matches the location of the water boundaries that we see in the satellite images that we use to create the land cover data. And it's important to note here that because this editing of the hydrography data is all manual, we're not looking for exact precision, but we're interested in having the hydrography line to be within about 5 meters of the correct location of the boundary that we see in the satellite imagery. And then the second step is to create these riparian management areas that I've already described. So those RMAs are our unit for analysis. And so those are an important component of the analysis. And as I just mentioned, we use that 50 meters fixed buffer width with the variable length. And so you can see in this example that we have some really short RMAs, and then some of the RMAs are much, much longer. So once we've created the RMAs, we then quantify intactness within each of those RMAs using a land cover data set that we create from a 6-meter resolution satellite image in combination with other terrain data that we derive from LiDAR. And while we create a land cover with many more classes than I actually show in this slide, we are essentially interested in land cover types that are fully natural. So when we classify the image, we have a number of different land cover types. And of those land cover types, we subset out the natural. We're also really interested in those land cover types that contain woody vegetation, because that's an important component of the scoring. So any vegetation types that contain trees or shrubs. And then we're also interested in human created or disturbed land cover types. And so in this image, I sort of illustrate how we take that land cover classification and we essentially turn it into a representation of these 3 different features that we're interested in. And then within each of those RMAs, we calculate the proportion of each of these different land cover types. And based on those proportions, we assign scores that then we used to classify the RMA into an intactness category. And basically those intactness categories, which range from high to very low, are based on the proportion of, or the ratio of natural to disturbed land cover types. So in this example, you can see that the green or the highly intact RMAs are dominated by natural and woody land cover types. And the low and the very low intactness RMAs contain more human footprint than natural cover. The second analysis that we complete as part of our riparian assessment is a pressure assessment. And this assessment looks at the condition of the lands that are adjacent to the 50-meter RMAs. And because we know that surface water flows across the landscape and eventually flows through riparian areas and into surface water bodies, this analysis looks at the landscape conditions that impact or could potentially impact the ecological or the hydrologic function of riparian areas. So for this assessment, we're interested in assessing lands at a larger spatial extent. And so we zoom out from the shorelines of interest and evaluate land cover within local catchment areas. And those local catchment areas are identified using freely available data from the government of Alberta. So within each of those local catchment areas, we assess the type and the amount of natural cover that's present, as well as the extent and the intensity of human disturbance. And the general premise of this assessment is that catchments with more natural cover have higher resilience, and therefore those are classified as lower pressure catchments. And on the flip side of that, catchments with a greater proportion of high intensity land uses are classified as catchments that are under high pressure. So the third and final analysis that we do is as part of this assessment is to basically combine the intactness scores that we get with the pressure scores and combine those using a matrix that assigns a conservation or a restoration priority category. So we assign conservation as well as restoration because we've recognized that while we typically are focused on questions around the restoration of lands, thinking more critically about locations that we want to conserve or protect because we have really good intact riparian habitats is also something that we really need to start focusing our attention on, because we know that it's much more costly and a lot more effort to restore. And if we are also focused on conservation of areas, we're likely to get better outcomes. So we use a simple matrix that classifies the areas with low or very low intactness, but high pressure as priority areas for restoration. And then areas with highly intact riparian habitats and lower pressure are generally classified as priority areas for conservation. So that was a really quick and pretty simplified explanation of how we go about assessing riparian areas using our satellite-based GIS method. And so now I just want to walk you through some of the results from the Pembina River Watershed assessment. So this assessment was focused on the Pembina River Watershed, which is located in the south central portion of the Athabasca watershed. And this assessment work that we've done feeds into a much larger goal that the Water Council had, or the Athabasca Watershed Council has, for improving flood and drought resiliency in this area. So the assessment is an important first step, but the subsequent steps of education and engagement with stakeholders and landowners is a really important next step to this work. The Pembina watershed is actually composed of 3 smaller Huck 6 watersheds. So the Huck stands for a hydrologic unit code, and it's just a simple way of basically creating nested scales of watersheds. So the Huck 6 watershed is provincial data that the government of Alberta created, and we use those Huck 6 watershed boundaries when we do these riparian assessments. And those Huck 6 watersheds within the Pembina, there's 3 of them, the upper, the mid, and the lower Pembina watersheds. And for this assessment, we assessed just over, well, nearly 4,000 kilometers of shoreline, with the largest proportion of that shoreline being located in the mid Pembina watershed. So just over 1,600 kilometers of shoreline in the mid. So a major task that was associated with this project was the creation of the land cover data set that we use to assess the riparian condition. And while we only measure intactness within that 50-meter buffer, we created a land cover data set that covers the entire portion of all 3 of those Huck 6 watersheds. So this was an area of about 14,000 square kilometers, so a pretty massive area that we now have a land cover data set for. The land cover data was created using a 6-meter resolution spot image, multiple images actually, from 2017 and 2018, because the study area was such a massive area. And we look for specific types of satellite imagery. So from certain times of year and imagery with minimal cloud cover, oftentimes we have to select imagery from different times of year or from different years. So this was an aggregation of multiple images over 2017 and 2018. The overall accuracy of our land cover data set is 93%, so pretty good accuracy. And you can see from the figure that as you move from the upper to the lower Pembina watershed, the proportion of natural cover decreases and the proportion of land cover types that are associated with agriculture and other types of human disturbance increases as you move from the upper to the mid to the low. So 71% of the shorelines that we assessed in all 3 of those watersheds combined together was classified as high intactness, with approximately 18% of the shoreline assessed as either low or very low. And when we break that down and summarize intactness by Huck6 watershed, you can see that for those water bodies that we did assess in this study, the greatest proportion of the shoreline classified as low and very low intactness was located in the mid-Pembina watershed. And the overwhelming majority of the shorelines assessed in the upper Pembina have been assessed as high intactness, with the lower Pembina Huck6 sort of being intermediate between the two. So I'm going to zoom into the mid-Pembina Huck6 watershed just to illustrate for you the types of data that we produce as part of these assessments, and to give you a sense for how you might be able to use this data to inform riparian area management. And here in this map, I show the water bodies that we assessed as part of this project. So this assessment was really focused on major lakes and rivers and streams within the watershed. So the lower order streams that are sort of the headwater streams in the watershed weren't assessed as part of this work. And the benefit or the benefit of this data is that we're able to, for each of those watersheds, look at intactness. And in fact, the way that we do this assessment is that because we assess the left and right bank separately, we have data for the left and the right bank of streams and rivers and creeks. And so we can take that data and we can aggregate it and summarize it in all kinds of different ways. And here in this example, you can see that we've calculated and summarized the length of shoreline that's assessed to each intactness category for each individual water body that we included in the study. So from this figure, you can see that the greatest length of the shoreline that we assessed in the watershed was associated with the Pembina River, and that the greatest length of shoreline assessed as low and very low intactness is associated with the Paddle River. So this is an important graph to sort of give you an idea of the relative length of shoreline that was assessed between the different water bodies. We can summarize this data also as the proportion of the shoreline for each water body that was assigned to each of those intactness categories. And the benefit of doing summarizing the data this way is that it allows you to really quickly see the overall condition of each water body. So in this example, Romeo Lake has a shoreline that's less than 10 kilometers in length. So those numbers are the length of shoreline associated with each of those intactness categories. So Romeo Lake has a shoreline that's just under 10 kilometers, but this figure tells you that over half of that shoreline was assessed as either low or very low condition. And so this type of information allows you to really easily target individual water bodies for management and on the ground restoration action if that's something that you're interested in, based on the proportion of the shoreline that's been impacted. So very often when we talk about riparian shoreline or riparian habitat management, we can set targets for a certain proportion of that shoreline to be in a particular condition. And so tracking and assessing condition using this approach is really helpful. So this data is also highly spatial, and so we can create maps that illustrate and show us the condition of individual shorelines for water bodies. And so we can separately map each of the right and the left banks if we're interested in, and we can also map condition for specific water bodies that we might be interested in. And so again, this allows us to spatially target some of our restoration or our conservation work if we're interested in doing that.